Welcome to Nutrition Science Bites, Series 3, and have I got a treat for you today? I'm talking to a special guest who's all the way over there in the United States of America, coming to us from Stanford University, Professor Christopher Gardner. Now, I have to tell you about Christopher because he's a Reinberg Farquhar Professor of Medicine at Stanford University and nutrition scientist, and he knows his stuff. He's been at it for 30 years. He's done more than 25 human nutrition intervention studies, and pretty much he's tested everything from Mediterranean to ketogenic, vegan, low fat, low carb, and their effects on health. I want to give him an extra shout out because he has served 2 years on the committee doing all the reviews to inform the dietary guidelines for America. Having been involved in that here in Australia myself, it's like the unsung hero. You kind of need a badge to say that you've worked so hard on behalf of your country. So, with all of that, welcome, Christopher Gardner.
Claire, it's a pleasure to be on your show.
Yeah, and it's a real pleasure to have you. And we're going to talk about today are macronutrients. I read out some of those diets you've researched, but the big study you did, the DIETFITS, I thought that was so admirable because you took it head to head, low fat, low carb, and and really. So, can you tell us a little bit about that DIETFITS study and what made you decide I'm actually just going to put low fat against low carb and see what happens?
Yeah, is it okay if I give the background? Because before that, I did the A to Z study, which is really very informative. Um, a long time ago, God, it started in 1999. I was doing lots of talks and studies, and for one particular day, I had a whole hour-long talk on garlic, and I said, "Does anybody have a question?" And they said, "Yeah, can I lose more weight on Atkins or Zone?" And I thought, wait a second. Just talked for an hour on garlic. Don't you want to know the putative active agent allicin and all the cool metabolism? And they said, no, I really just want to lose weight. And so I decided, God, this is just burning in people's minds, this low fat, low carb controversy. And we got 311 women to do an Atkins very low carb, a Zone pretty low carb, a health professional's diet, or an Ornish diet was very high carb, very low fat. And it was about 75 women in each of those arms for a year. There was very little difference in the average weight loss, but within all four groups, there was this range of weight change differential from losing 20 kilos to gaining 5 kilos. And I thought, wait a sec, there's more difference within each one of these groups than between the groups. And so maybe we should do a follow-up study and let's look for some of what those explanations might be. And we had hit upon either a metabolic predisposition, which could have been insulin resistance, suggesting that maybe the folks who are sort of pre-diabetic and insulin resistant might really do better on low carb because they have a hard time putting them away. And the ones who are more insulin sensitive might actually do better on the traditional low fat that had been proposed for so long.
So, Chris, are you saying that, when you saw this big range, what did you say from like gaining a few kilos to losing 20 kilos, you actually didn't go, oh, yeah, that's because you were cheating or you weren't following the diet. So, what was it that made you think, wow, there's really something biological? And you had talked about looking at their insulin and their genetics. What made you decide that you were going to go with your gut instinct, that there was more to it than just, oh, not sticking to the diet? Because I think this is a big thing for people.
So I actually think that was just due to our incredible staff that worked with the study participants. They were trying their best. So Claire, you I'm sure can appreciate that in that kind of study, we have to do a lot of diet assessment. And we're trying to get people to be as adherent as they can to one diet versus another. And as opposed to the kind of study where you lock people up and they can't get out and you can watch exactly what they're doing, which means you can only do a few people at a time. If you want to do 311 women, you have to leave them on their own. And so you're always a little worried that they are cheating or not following. And what was really fascinating is how many women would talk to us and say, oh my God, I just have to get this off my chest. I can't. I'm almost so embarrassed. Are you going to kick me out of this study? I had a Coke. Said, how many Cokes did you have? Just one last week. And I haven't been able to sleep at night. I said, this is all about one Coke
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
had? And it really made me feel like they were taking the science seriously, which is honestly how I set up all of our studies. I usually do all the orientations where I get the participants to sign informed consent. And I say, look, if you're really not into this, just don't sign up and read about it when we're done, because America wants to know which one of these is going to win. And if you're going to do it, really need you to take it seriously so that we have the best scientific answer. And I really felt like the participants, for the most part, from what we could tell, little hints here and there, were really taking it seriously. And if they were taking it that seriously and they were getting that much of a range of response, I wanted to
Yeah.
look into that further.
Well, Christopher, I think you were actually a bit ahead of your time then, because we're studying personalized nutrition here and looking at genetics. But, you said you were doing this, at the turn of the century. So I think by working with your participants so carefully, you really, really did get those early insights and value that this different in response. So what happened? What happened next?
So we also found, actually, so the inside scoop, you may not want to cover all this, is my grant application got rejected multiple times when I wanted to look at this insulin resistance predisposition. And then a new colleague came on board and some new data came on board to suggest there might be a genetic predisposition. So I submitted the grant again and say maybe metabolic predisposition, maybe genetic predisposition. Boom, funded. So
Wow. Yeah.
they liked the idea.
Perseverance.
They liked the idea of the genetic predisposition. So we said, okay, we're going to do 600 people this time. It's going to be men and women. We're not going to do 4 diets. We're going to just stick with 2. We're going to do low carb and low fat. And I don't know how much you want to let me get into this, but when you say low carb and low fat, how low is low fat? How low is low carb? And is it the same for everyone? Because I think we took a fairly novel approach to this, but we did have just 2 diets and we focused a lot on quality. Can I
Yeah.
expand on that?
Yeah, I want you to expand on that because, one of my bugbears is when people say low fat is that, as you and I know, it depends on what you eat. So I think, yes, please expand on what you mean by the high quality aspect of each of these diets.
So we named this Limbo titrate quality, which doesn't really roll off your tongue unless you know what
No.
it means. So usually in a grant, yeah, to get this past the reviewers, you would have to say by low carb, I mean this many grams or this percent, and by low fat, I mean this many grams or this percent. And what I could tell was people were approaching their low fat and low carb very differently. It's impossible to get everybody to hit the same number. So instead of aiming for a number and having some people more or less adherent to that one number, we didn't know what the optimal low fat or the optimal low carb level was. I'd never seen it anywhere, and I'd seen everything from a little bit to none to pretty much. So we explained to people, we are going to randomize you. Based on our hypothesis, we're going to randomize half of you to the wrong diet. You can
Yeah.
probably expect to come to a session with the fellows in your group and look across the table and have one of them say, ha, this is so fun, the pounds are just melting off. And you're going to look at them and say, what do you mean melting off? I'm working my butt off to make this diet work, and I'm not really losing anything. And everybody, that's the point of the study. We really think that some of you will have an easier time than others. And I want you to know that you won't be kicked out of the study. In fact, you're going to help define for the American public what that means when you say low fat and low carb and what it means for different people. So the limbo phase was, we have a goal for you. In the first 8 weeks, we would like you to drop to 20 grams of carb or 20 grams of fat, knowing that your typical diet is about 300 grams of carb and 90 or 100 grams of fat. And that's a huge difference. It's not a little difference.
Yeah.
And we're
That's
doing this so that you think, oh my God, I am making huge changes in my diet. Not a modest one. I'm making a huge change in my diet for the sake of science. But from what we've seen, people who get really extremely low in carb or low in fat are missing some nutrients. If you're
yeah.
that restrictive, you really can't get the balance of nutrients. So he said, this is actually more of a psychological set point. I know I'm in a study. I'm trying to get rid of almost all my carbs or fats. And to be honest, in the 1 year study, given that we asked them to do this within 8 weeks, we didn't even have a diet assessment at 8 weeks. And we didn't have a set number of weeks to get there. In fact, we said some of you are probably type AA, and some of you are type B people, and some of you are going to do this next week, and some of you at 8 weeks are going to say, I'm still not there yet. And we don't care. The whole point is for you to go as low as you can. And then given that we actually think there are some nutrients that you might be deficient in, that your body's craving, we're going to follow up the 8 week phase with a titrate phase. And the
Yep.
titrate phase is add some carbs or fats back. Does this work for your social life? Does this work for your hunger and satiety? Does this work for other things? If not, add a little more back. And it'll add a little more back. And at some point, if you think, wow, I actually was losing a bunch of weight and now it's coming back on. I was doing better when I was being more restrictive. Go ahead and titrate back down again and try to find this place where you could look us in the eye and say, I really think this is the lowest in carb or fat that I could get.
Yep.
And maintain. So when the study's over, I won't immediately say, whew, study's over. I can now go back to the way I want to eat. We want you to say, if this really worked for you, I could keep eating this way. This is something that I could maintain. So that was the point of the titrate phase. And we said not the icing on the cake, but the hummus on the carrot stick here was going
Yeah.
to be that you had to do it at quality. You couldn't go to the store and find low fat or low carb brownies, cookies, chips, whatever. We wanted you to go to the farmer's market. And interestingly, we wanted everybody to limit refined grains and added sugars. Those are low fat. Okay, but we don't want you to have that kind of low fat.
I think that's a really important key is in the quality, isn't it? That you are having people avoid those really processed things that have got the signs all over the labels and a whole bunch of monster ingredients, but really taking people back to real food. On average, how long did that titrate phase last? And did you help people practically? Because I imagine you probably had some people who actually weren't really used to preparing foods from scratch.
Oh, absolutely. So maybe what I didn't mention, there's 22 classes. So there's a class a week for 8 weeks, and then a class every other week for 2 months, and then a class every third week for 2 months, and then once a month after that. So we had 4 dietitians, and each one held classes of about 15 people. And here's another
Yeah.
fun thing, Claire, is that each one of the dietitians had to do both low fat and low carb. We didn't have experts in one or the other.
Yep.
And just think about this professionally. Think when we hired the dietitians, we said, you may have a predisposition and prefer low fat or low carb, and we don't really care what that is, but we want you to teach the best low fat you possibly can and the best low carb you possibly can, so you can sleep at night, that you haven't
Yep.
told a group of people to eat something that you are horrified to think what it's doing to them overnight. And so when it came to low carb, we didn't say butter and lard and steak. We said olive oil and avocados and nuts and seeds and fatty fish. And so we asked
Yeah.
them both to do limbo, then titrate, then quality, and say this should
Yeah.
be a high quality low carb and a high quality low fat, so that both groups have the same chance of doing well.
I think what distinguishes DIETFITS, Christopher, is actually that the focus on quality. And I got to admit that, when you say low fat, kind of does my head in because of all those reasons you've articulated. So that's why I think this study is really important. But so what happened? What happened then? So you've got given them all that social support. Sounds like it would have been fun to be in those groups to promote the quality aspect. So who was the winner?
So at the end of the day, so we have to start with the fake outcome, and the fake outcome was weight loss. And after 12 months, the average weight loss in one group was 11 pounds and the other group was 12 pounds. And the one
Can
pound,
you convert that to kilos
sure,
roughly
sure, sure,
for
right? So
us
this is
Aussies?
5 and 5.5 kilos ish, right? And
Yep.
so at the end of the day, the average difference wasn't different exactly like we predicted from our old A to Z study. And the range in both of them was even higher. This time we were up at 25 kilos of weight loss and 10 kilos of weight gain. There was
Wow.
like a 40 kilo difference. I'm not sure if those numbers added up. It sounds like 35. Okay, 35 or 40 kilo difference in range. And those were not outliers. It was an absolute continuum, which I love showing in a graphic that we call a waterfall plot, where you have every single person be one line in the graph. And if it was an outlier, you would have seen one or two people just really sticking out from the rest of the group.
Yeah.
The one who lost or gained the second most, the third most, the fourth most, the fifth most,
Wow.
they were all right in line. And so, just for a moment, let's just pause and say, oh my God, this is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to see a massive amount of variability in the two diets on good quality low carb or low fat. And then I can dive in and see if my metabolic predisposition or my genetic predisposition explain that huge amount of variability within each group. And Claire, so should we do the drum roll now? You
Can we
ready?
do the drum roll? Because I was just going to bust right in on you there and say, tell us the drum roll, and then I've got a bunch more questions for you. Okay, so drum roll. What was?
Boom. No, nothing different. It's not the metabolic insulin resistance and not the genetic predisposition. And so,
Wow.
big deathly moment of silence here. What the F? This is an $8 million study. If you take into account all the grant rejections I got, the 5 years it took to run the study, the year it took to get it published in JAMA, basically we showed nothing. I thought, oh my God, this is super disappointing on the one hand. And so, pretty.
Except you didn't show nothing because you actually showed exactly what your instinct was, that there's a massive variation. But so I've got to ask you now, maybe it needs another drum roll, but is what was it then? What were some of those factors that explained that huge variability, especially within each of the groups? And was it more variability in the low fat or more variability in the low carb?
No, the variability was virtually identical. So when you take what I call these waterfall plots and put them one on top of the other, low carb and low fat, they're almost indistinguishable. They really, the highs and the lows are just the same. So we've now probably published 30 side papers
Wow.
based on this data set. And for the genetics, let's just pause there for a minute. So we had worked with a group that had actually gone back to our A to Z diet study and asked us to pull out some DNA. And they, in an exploratory way, found a 3-SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism, a 3-SNP metabolic pattern or genetic pattern that they thought would differentiate these. That didn't work. And if you can think of the 50 or so SNPs that have been related to obesity, one of my postdoctoral research fellows at the time mockingly said, okay, so given there's 50 of these and you tested a pattern of 3, that means that one doesn't work, but there's 999,099 other possible genetic patterns that you didn't test, right? And I said,
Oh
well,
dear. How many years have you got then to look at those? But I'm guessing you did go and look at some other genes.
so he did. And so actually someone just published a paper on this. And in retrospect, they found something with a genetic SNP. Another set of investigators also went at it a different way and found a different genetic pattern. But Claire, these are tough because this is taking
Yeah.
data that you already have
Yeah.
and in an exploratory way, looking for something that emerges as the most explanatory. And that's a circular argument there. Something has to be the most.
Yeah, that's
If
right.
you,
Yeah.
if
So
you
it's
really want
challenging.
if you really want to test this, you have to say, I had an idea ahead of time and I applied it and it worked. And it helped some people to know which one they were. You can't go back after the fact and prove it. It's really more of a hypothesis generating step than a hypothesis testing step.
But I think the fact that you've shown that for some people there is genetic variability that's contributing to their more likely to gain or lose weight. I think that's kind of what I bet you the people in your study kind of know that. Like you were saying that some people,
Yeah.
this is not fair. I'm working so hard and nothing's really happening. And some people following the diet and the weight's just falling off them without seemingly the same amount of effort. So, so you've told us there's something there about genetics, but what about metabolism, especially related to blood sugars? Because everyone knows that relates to your risk for diabetes, and not everybody develops diabetes.
So I'm going to address that two ways. It's pretty interesting that one person who was really invested in the study, just before we finished, said, "You know what, Christopher, I think you screwed up the study." I said, "What do you mean we screwed it up? Oh my God, we're almost at the end. We're about to analyze it. How could we have screwed it up?" And they said, "You told both groups to eat a healthy diet. You
Oh,
told
right.
them no," and this is actually a low carb fan who made this criticism. He said, most people who go low fat end up eating a lot of added sugar and refined grain, and you told them not to. That's going to undermine the whole study. And what do you mean it's going to undermine the whole study? That was a really important premise for me to say, okay, we know that's crappy. That's a horrible way to go low fat. If you want to give low fat the best chance it has, it should be whole grains and it
Yeah.
shouldn't be added sugar. It should be the sugars from fruits. So that was a really interesting comment for them to make. So then looking a little more deeply at some of the reasons for differences, I have a wonderful story about an undergraduate. So we had done resting metabolic rate in the study. So that's a test where, for those of your listeners who've never heard of this, or perhaps basal metabolic rate is another way to frame it. So as soon as you wake up in the morning and drive to the facility, you lie down and you have to be totally quiet. And they put this ridiculous mask on your face and you breathe in and out. And once you've calculated the amount of oxygen you're taking in and the amount of CO2 you're breathing out, you can determine how much fat and carbohydrate and what that mixture is that you're burning and how many calories you're burning. And so we were very interested in the resting metabolic rate. And as a side project, we gave this undergraduate the data set to look at. And on her own, she said, "Wow, that's interesting. That data set you gave me actually showed me that proportion of fat and carbs." And I decided to look at that on my own. And that actually ended up being a whole separate paper. And if you
Wow.
look at, these are really modest differences. So being the nutrition expert that you are, the rough range is zero point 0.7 if it's all fat and 1.0 if it's all carb that you're consuming. And if it's a mix, it's usually around 0.82, this respiratory exchange ratio. And so what she found is really subtle differences like up to 0.84, down to 0.80, helped explain who was doing better on one diet than another. And that was just sort of their natural ability to burn different amounts of carbs and fat.
Yeah. And I think that's really important because sometimes with metabolic rate, I kind of liken it to the car. You turn the engine on, it's just ticking over. Well, that's your metabolic rate. And we all know that some cars run better on different types of fuel. You put the wrong fuel in the wrong car, and you might have actually just wrecked the engine. So it's kind of like that, isn't it? So you were able, after the fact, to identify the fuel type some of their bodies ran better on and got a better study result. I bet you they wish they could have known that at the start.
And it didn't explain all the difference. It only explained a little of the difference. Can I bring up another side paper?
Only if I can ask you another question, because if I'm the listener, I'm thinking, okay, Christopher, how can you predict for me which fuel my body's going to need and help me optimize my body composition and get to the body weight I want to be? Can you predict that for me, please? I'm sure that's what people are asking and thinking.
Yeah, and that first of all, you'd have to take this test, and second, I'm going to have to go back to the paper and see which way it was, because since it didn't explain everything, I'd have to double check and see which one it is. But I think if it was, if you were traditionally burning more carb, then being on a low carb diet helped you, and if you were traditionally burning more fat, being on the low fat diet helped you. But
Okay, well, I think one way then potentially for people. And we'll put the link in the show notes to a couple of your papers because, people who love reading scientific journals, not everybody, but some people do, then at least they've got the link to the very ones we're talking about. But I think that kind of makes sense. Like I know I'd describe myself as a carb lover, and some people would basically describe themselves as carnivores. They just love everything that's got protein and fat in and, could give a slice of bread, couldn't give it the time of day. So I think that probably does help people. And then what that also tells me, Christopher, then if you told me I've got to go low fat, well, that's going to be way, way different. And I'm going to go, well, I've got nothing to eat that I like, so I'm probably going to then
Yes,
drop weight.
that is part of the reason, right? So I am hungry. So let's say I'm on low fat and I've eaten and eaten and eaten, and I see, okay, I'm not really full yet, but I don't want another piece of bread or a carrot or this other thing. What I really want is a piece of cheese, but I'm on low fat and I can't have cheese, so I'm not going to eat because I know I can't
Yeah,
have cheese.
yeah, yeah.
If
So
you
you
get,
end up with less kilojoules or calories. Yeah.
yeah, so that part's really interesting, and it does. It makes practical sense.
Now, I cut you off and you're going to tell us something else, but then I'm also going to want to ask you, were there any other surprises? Like, did men do better than women, or did women do better than men? Were there any other surprises in the data? But I think you said 30 research papers, so I imagine there a lot of them are surprises.
Yeah. So one woman, Lucia Aronica, looked by gender, and she looked at low fat and low carb. And this is going to be a little nuanced. It's not perfect. Um, so the men did better than the women losing weight on low carb. That was just one thing. Okay.
Okay, so in low carb, men did better. And if we make this is really sweeping, but in general, say, well, a lot of blokes like a lot of meat and fattier foods, so that's going to be a really way different diet for them. So
Yeah.
that kind of fits in. But did the women then, does that mean the women did better on the other one?
So now so part of the twist was not only did we look by gender, but we looked at the adherence to the diets by diet type and gender.
Yeah.
And the women on low fat and low carb roughly lost the same amount of weight. They didn't lose a different amount of weight. But what was really interesting was the women assigned to low carb did not do as well adhering to it.
Oh, right. Yeah, because now I can't have my toast. I can't have a cookie
Well,
or a piece of cake. But I can't have fruit either. So, yeah, I think you've got to explain a bit more on that one.
no, so the women assigned to low carb, which is high fat. So when we wrote up the paper, we said women are more predisposed than men to fear fat. They've been told their whole life to fear fat. And so we actually, to explain this difference, just as a way to interpret it and put it in the context of other literature, we said there's literature out there to show that when you ask women to eat low carb and high fat, they're a little more resistant than men to do that because they've been taught their whole life not to be fat.
All
We,
right.
we try to explain to them that eating fat doesn't make you fat, but that's psychologically, they still think if I eat fat, which has 9 kilocalories per gram instead of 4 for protein and carbs, I might get fat. They just had a harder time adhering. And if they had had an easier time adhering, they might have lost more weight than on low fat.
Sounds like you're hatching a plan for your next study. But I think we can add that because that tells me then that social norms are really important.
Absolutely.
Because if like now I'm on high fat and I go out with all my friends and I'm going to be the only one who's eating things higher in fat, it may be that that's also not socially acceptable.
True.
So, yeah, and everyone else is having a healthy something, and you can't have it. I think maybe you just stop going out as well. You just stop hanging out. And then I think you'd get a bit depressed actually. So, how much does that side of it come into it? Like that emotional side and the support, the social support from your friends and things like that.
So we did a whole psychological analysis of that, and nothing came out very strong. So
Oh,
we had a whole battery of psychosocial questions, and this had to do with support from family, support from friends, uh, a whole battery of those questions. So that's been published as well. And that was not very definitive. We found, because we were looking, we found some things that were the most predictive, but the degree of how predictive they were was quite modest. It wasn't really very good, but I got another one.
Yeah. Oh, off you go. Tell me the other one then.
So one of our postdocs is a Harvard trained physician and a cordon bleu trained chef.
Wow.
She was really interested in the quality message that we had for people. So just because we told them to choose quality doesn't mean everybody achieved that at the same level. So she has written a side paper where she made a 2 by 2 table for each group, the low carb and the low fat group. And so one was above or below the median in how low you got in carb or fat, and one was above or below the median in the healthy eating index, this
Right.
index of the level of quality in your diet. So you could either be really low and good quality,
Yep.
or really low and bad quality,
Yep.
or really quality and not so good, and bad of both. You could have been not good quality and didn't get very low. When you did both, when you were not only low in carb or fat, but you also were high in quality, that's who lost the most weight when you hit them both.
Right.
So
So you hit the advice target and you also hit the target around the nutritional quality. So you met more likely to meet all of your micronutrients. Well, I'm thinking that's actually a really big message to tell people. Would you say, like, really focusing on the nutritional quality of the foods that you're eating if you're seeking to reduce your body weight?
absolutely. And I do agree with the guy who called me out and said, "Oh my God, you undermined the whole study. You screwed up. You had them both eating really well." I thought, well, no, if they're both eating, what if everybody lost 50 pounds? We'd be world famous. And so let's give both diets 50 pounds, 20, what, 3 kilos?
25 kilos. Roughly, we always just roughly divide by
We
two,
do
even though
by
it's
two.
2.1.
I know
Yeah,
it's 2.2.
yeah,
So
2.2. Yeah,
they didn't lose 50. A couple people lost 23 kilos. But
yeah.
at the end of the day, it really felt good to give them both the best shot possible and not stack the deck that one would be better than the other. And so I think we learned a lot more from
I was
doing
going to ask you, so what are the main recommendations out of your study? But I'm going to have a crack at, I think I've heard them, and then you tell me if I'm right or wrong on what you would add. So, because again, this is the thing that really annoys me. Can you hear that in my voice? Really annoys me with the throwaway one-liner diets. Go zero carb or whatever. Then people miss out on the quality. So I'm thinking that your message is essentially do whatever of those flavors, low fat, low carb, actually appeals to you personally that you can stick with, but really go for the quality. And based on your study, I'm going to say go and get professional help. It's probably from a dietitian in Australia to really optimize the quality. That, Christopher, is missing in many, many of the diets. So, like, well done to you and your team for focusing on that. And I don't think you got it wrong. I think you're the ones who got it right, if you ask me.
So it was really fun, Claire, how much love I got from our study. So initially, a couple people said, Limbo, titrate, quality, what a stupid study. You should have said this percent and tried to get everybody to get to that percent. And I said, no, not really. We actually wanted to see this sort of range of what people would thought was the lowest they could go. And this sets a more realistic expectation. And we wanted both of them to eat high quality. And if that meant no difference between the groups and even no difference between our predisposing metabolic or genetic factor, that meant the quality was probably more important. And the amount of love I got from the health professional community was great. It was like, oh, thank you for this study.
Yeah.
I'm telling my clients and my patients that, it's not so much the low carb or the low fat, it's choosing high quality foods. And this actually gives them more flexibility and not pigeonholing them into one diet or another because they're cursed and they're genetically predisposed, but they should go for quality and maybe do a little individual experimentation on which one
Yeah.
is better.
And I know we're starting to run out of time, but I do want to ask you one more question about like what they actually did in the study, because unless you enroll in like a program that has support, not many people ever get like that 22 weeks of support. So all your participants did. So did you see that they made some really interesting changes in their dietary patterns, given that you are saying quality, don't eat ultra processed foods, but try and make some basic new recipes at home? Did you find that people like got into that?
Yeah, but Claire, the variety there was massive. It was huge. Let me tell you about another side paper we did, if it's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So the same woman, Lucia Aronica, that I mentioned that did the gender paper said, I'm really interested in the ones who were the most adherent to the study. So
Yeah.
let's take the 10% of the participants who got the absolute lowest in carb or the absolute lowest in fat. And let's see if the most adherent at that level, you see a difference. And we didn't. They actually lost more weight than anyone else when they were most adherent, but it wasn't different between the groups. And what she was focused on was the 3-month data. So that's when people were sort of
Yeah.
most excited about the study, but we had 12-month data. So here's one of the most surprising and interesting findings there. So among the people who were the most adherent at 3 months, if you
Yeah.
follow them out to 12 months, they still ended up with more weight loss than anybody in their average group. But to me, the most surprising thing was the low fat group, who
Yeah.
we told to have no added sugar and no refined grain. They still were, they added a lot of carbs back to, a lot of, wait, they're low fat. So they added more low fat back to their diet. So they were higher in fat at the end than they were at 3 months, but they were
Yeah.
still pretty low in fat. But what was really stunning was the way they had maintained that was
Yeah.
to add back more added sugar and more refined grain than they had before the study started.
Really? So it changed their taste buds in some way.
So even though they were like the most adherent and they got the biggest drop possible, they had to replace it with something. And as they went, they actually did better early in the study, but 12 months out, when life gets in the way and life is busy, the way they were doing it was adding more added sugar and more refined grain than they had at the beginning, which is to me another, I know how well you understand this nuances. When you're trying to get really low in one thing, you're going to end up high in
You,
something else unless you pay attention to the whole thing.
but you know what that tells me is that people need the ongoing support and
Yeah.
the re-checkups. And some of the interesting things about your study, though, that absolutely fit with what's out in the literature is that people who adhere do actually lose more weight, and that people need support, and people who get a lot of support do better. So, your studies are unusual in that you tick the box in all of those things and that it's applicable to the real world and people's real lives. So, I know we're getting close to running out of time, but I want to ask you because you've published 30 papers from that study. You obviously got more and more questions outside of DIETFITS. What is the key thing you think still needs to be answered in research when it comes to nutrition and approaches to reducing body weight?
Satiety. That's the key. So here's a fun thing that happened in the middle of this study. So we actually ran this study from about 2012 to 2015 or 16, published it in 2018, and in 2013, a paper was published by the American College of Cardiology, the Obesity Society, and the American Heart Association. And it said, look, we're going to get a panel of folks together. We're going to look at all the diets out there for weight loss, and we're going to come up with some summary statements, and we're going to use these very objective terms for scientific evidence. And we are going to look at 15 different diets. And our main conclusion is some people lost weight on every single diet out there. No matter what diet it is, some people lose weight. There aren't any diets out there that work for everyone. If we were to come up with one summary conclusion, it really has energy restriction or an energy deficit that leads to weight loss. That's not rocket science. But there's one little paragraph, Claire, that I've been clinging to and love this line where it said, just so you know, the studies all in total were a combination that had a prescribed energy deficit or an achieved energy deficit. So stop for a minute and think that what that is. So for a prescribed energy deficit in a weight loss study, somebody says, "Oh, I did the calculation and I think you need 2,200 calories to maintain your weight. So if you want to lose 1 pound a week, the standard thing is 500 calories less per day. So instead of eating 2,200, you should shoot for 1,700 calories a day. For a week? No, forever. You should eat 1,700 calories a day and have this 500 calorie deficit every day forever," which is so depressing. It's like, seriously, I'm going to be freaking hungry every day forever? This sucks. Or what we had realized was, without being intentional about this, we had never prescribed an energy restriction. We said, try to eat really low in carb or fat, try to only do quality, and look us in the eye and tell us you're not hungry. As if you're not hungry, then we'll know
Yeah.
when the study's over, you could continue this. And I think what happened was, for some people, the low carb or low fat quality diet was satiating for them. And those are the ones who lost the most weight. And I would love to go back and figure a way out to see if there are personal differences in satiety. And so that is my sneaking suspicion. Is I'm still not quite sure how to design this study, but I really do feel for somebody, the avocados are more filling, and for somebody else, the steel cut oats are more filling. And if you put a bunch of foods on top of each other, somebody's going to be more satiated with low carb and somebody's going to be more satiated with low fat. And if they could do that enough to see the high quality foods that fill them up the most and stop their meals soonest and keep them full the longest before their next meal, that's where the gold is. And I haven't figured out how to get rich on that yet, but that's satiety is, I think, the
Sounds to me,
that
it
I need.
sounds to me, Christopher, like you're hatching your next big study there, which is a really good idea. So, the other fun thing that we do in this podcast is ask people if they'd like to donate a recipe to our website, No Money, No Time, which is a culinary nutrition website that really tries to help people who are time poor eat on a restricted budget. So, your recipe, can you tell me about it? It sounds amazing. Now, you've called it pomegranate glazed eggplant with squash and tempeh. I just have to tell you one Australian translation. Squash, we just call it butternut pumpkin. So, we're gonna put squash in the brackets as the Aussie language translation when we put that recipe and up with along with your picture on our website. But it just sounds delicious. What made you pick that one?
So my father-in-law is an incredible cook, and he cooks vegan all the time, and we go to his house once a week, and it was a dish he made. And I said, oh my God, what is this? He showed me the recipe. I made it at home. I have 4 sons. All of my sons cook this recipe. I've made
Oh,
it for
wow.
guests that come over and then, oh my God. And it's really pretty simple. You chop up butternut squash into cubes. You chop up eggplant into cubes. You add some tempeh in cubes. You get some olive oil and pomegranate molasses, and you mix that together with some lemon zest and some herbs, and just sort of roll around that combination of 3 different major food groups and bake it. And it comes out with this pomegranate glaze, and it is super delicious.
It just sounds amazing. I've actually bought my ingredients so that I can make it home. So I'll put a post of that on social media as well.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today and for Nutrition Science Bites. It's been fabulous having you as a guest. So much food for thought. And I'm going to put links in the show notes to all of those, including for your wonderful recipe. So thank you, Christopher Gardner.
And thank you, Claire. You asked the best question. So clearly you understand this more than anybody I really get to talk to from all the thought you've given to these same questions. Thank you for your excellent moderating.
My absolute pleasure.